Yes, go ahead, Senator Munning, and then we'll go on to Mr.
Yes,
Bishop.
and I know we're not through our panel yet, but just on the presentation from Dr. Boland, you mentioned the development of regs pursuant to SB4. What's the timetable?
Those have gone into effect. Sort of they went into effect. They were approved by the Office of Administrative Law the end of 2014, and they went into effect in full force on July 1st of this year.
And how would you rate compliance to date?
The operators know that we are witnessing everything that we're doing. The witnessing rates, as I said, exceed 80–85% for all of the activities. For well stimulation, it's 100%. And so the operators are complying with the requirements, and when they don't, we send them, we make sure we get them to comply.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just also want to offer my welcome aboard to Mr. Bunn and thank him for his history of public service, and it's great to have you back.
Thank you.
I had a question for Dr. Boland. In your interagency working group, which I think is a good idea, do you see a role for CCST sort of being a participant in an advisory capacity in that working group? You've had 8 meetings, you're implementing or reviewing their recommendations?
So I don't have an answer for that yet. Certainly they have recommended that there be a science advisory committee of some sort. I just thought, and I embrace that. I think it would be terrific to have that. I think it would be very valuable, especially for the division, but more broadly. I
get the ongoing Science Advisory Council. I just kept thinking if
the first 8 meetings were with the science team.
Good.
They were basically briefings of the team and discussions about the details of the report. So that's exactly what the first 8 meetings were.
Okay, so including them was a good idea. So ongoing, I hope you will do that. There's no more discharges into the percolation pit, so you recommend phasing out the existing ones if you've I assume you're going to be testing them, or the water board will be testing them when they. Yeah,
I will. That's.
He's getting ready.
That's Jonathan's bailiwick, so I'm not going to answer it. But I will say that we have been monitoring the compliance with the containment of the fluids as required by the regulations, and we know that that is occurring.
Most other states are phasing them out. Is that, you see us going in that direction?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe you do.
I'll go to Jonathan, then I'll just tee that up for him to. And then one thing on the chemical disclosure, I know we post online the major chemicals, but I think what came out from the science report that struck me as something I hadn't thought about is the interaction with different chemicals and how they react with the rock type and over time. So what are we going to do about that? Because just posting them online doesn't seem to really get to that core data gap.
No, that's correct. And we're already talking with the Department of Toxic Substance Control to do an extensive study of the recovered fluids and to look at those through time. This is a complicated area. We already know from the considerable amount of work that's been done in the academic community that the chemistry of the fluids is complex, how the chemicals interact. You know, after all, you're taking this water-based fluid with some chemicals in it and putting it into a hydrocarbon reservoir and then extracting it. So there's a lot that can go on. So there does need to be more study. We're working with, as I said, DTSC to actually kick off that study soon, because it'll depend to some degree on the geologic formation into which you are, that you are stimulating as to what actually flows back. So it's an important area of study, and we support that.
Do we have, besides the interaction, which will take additional study, although there's some sense of urgency
right, sure,
on that we're not having unintended consequences while we wait for studies, do we have a completed list that is submitted on all the chemicals being used?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. I mean, it's required, so.
Before and after.
That's correct. And the final report, the disclosure report, is due 60 days after a well stimulation has taken place.
And final question, now that the EIRs done, or the permanent regulations are in place, do we have well stimulation treatment permits that are being issued under the new regulations? Are they in process?
So we have not issued any permits under the new regulations as of yet. There are.
Because no one is
There's about 1,000 notices that are outstanding. So there's some backlog from that which was allowed under the interim regulations, but we haven't received an application as of yet under the full regulations.
They will be reviewed if they predate the finalization.
So any permit that was granted prior to July 1, when they operate, they have to operate under the full regulations.
All right, thank you very much for that clarification, and I look forward to working with you. And I appreciate your 15 months that you've worked at this. We're seeing improvement, so thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. So one thing we have that's really been beneficial is the memorandum of agreement between the State Water Board and the Division of Oil and Gas Recovery, because so many of our concerns were water-related. So please give us an update what's going on in your house. Underground injection wells and percolation ponds, perhaps.
Yes. Well, good morning, and thank you, Chair Pavley and members of the board, for the opportunity to speak this morning. Today, I will provide you with a brief update on our progress in implementing the SB4 requirements, which directly relate to many of the recommendations in the report that pertain to the water boards. Senate Bill 4 required the water boards to develop model criteria for groundwater monitoring as related to well stimulation activities. On July 7th, the State Water Board adopted the model criteria after a year-long public process. The State Board consulted with the Division of Oil and Gas and Geothermal Resources, the regional water boards, technical experts from USGS and Lawrence Livermore, stakeholders, and the public. We relied in the development of that model criteria on recommendations provided by Lawrence Livermore National Lab as they made the detailed recommendations for us. The model criteria has three major components, two of which I'll talk about today: the area-specific monitoring, which is conducted by the operators, and the regional monitoring, which is conducted by the State Water Board in consultants with the USGS. There is also codifies our requirements in the interim regulations about neighbor notification for stimulation activity, but we didn't change that from the interim, and I wasn't going to go into detail unless you have questions. The area-specific monitoring, which relates to a couple of the recommendations, 5.1 and 5.2 of the report, covers monitoring conducted by the oil field operators. This builds on the work in the interim regulations that was put in place a year and a half ago, but it increases the requirements, but allows for some flexibility. The flexibility is based on allowing multiple wells to be, multiple well stimulation activities to be covered by one monitoring plan, so that we don't punch too many more holes into the ground to monitor each activity if we can do it in a group. In addition, we increase the analytical requirements and amount of chemicals that needed to be monitored. And just like the interim, we continued the ability for there be an exclusion from groundwater monitoring requirements if there is no groundwater to be monitored, or if that groundwater is exempt because it's over 10,000 or has an aquifer exemption. The second portion is on the regional monitoring program. Regional monitoring program would be developed by the State Water Board in collaboration with the U.S. Geologic Survey. That program kicks in January of 2016. This covers recommendations in the report for 3.3 and 4.1 are directly relate to that. Due to the absence that you heard today repeatedly of information about water quality associated with oil field productions, the first part of this program will be phased to focus on groundwater near oil fields and assess the activities not just of the of hydraulic fracturing, but of the whole oil field operations on its potential impact and actual impacts to groundwater, as was described by the report. All of the data and information from the regional monitoring and from the area-specific monitoring will be in our GeoTracker Gamma database, which is publicly available and geographically enabled, I guess is the word that I'm looking for, so that you can go in and look at a map and see the wells there, and then look at the information associated with those wells. The State Water Board required us in the adoption of the SB4 monitoring requirements to periodically come back and tell them how it's going and make updates and revisions if necessary. So we will be reporting annually on that to the State Water Board. And we will also be convening a stakeholder group of both industry representatives and environmental organizations to look at what are the most important performance measures for us to be tracking, so that we make sure that we're focused on the most important issues. Since the model criteria went into effect in July of this year, July 7th, we have not actually received any groundwater monitoring plans under that plan yet, but we expect to in the near future. But to give you some idea of the groundwater monitoring associated with well stimulation activities, we have reviewed 42 monitoring plans under the interim requirements in the last year and a half. We approved 36 of them. The remainder are in going back for to be revised so that they meet the requirements. We've also been requested 31 aquifer exemptions for exemptions from the need for a groundwater monitoring plan in areas where there is no groundwater, or that groundwater does not have beneficial use. Of those, we approved 21. The other 10 we did not approve, and they're required to do groundwater monitoring associated with them. And then I will just take a quick minute to respond to the findings of the report. As I mentioned as I was going along, we have a number of areas of which the report indicates that we should be looking at that fall under the requirements that we've already implemented under SB4, the area-wide monitoring associated with the by the operators, which addresses a number of the issues about shallow groundwater and looking at potential impacts. We've also, under the regional monitoring program, we'll be looking at data gaps associated with information on the groundwater associated in proximity to oil fields. And additionally, the concerns on oil field disposal of produced water into pits. We have a program at the Central Valley Board that's been in place now, moving forward to investigate these discharges to pits. As Dr. Boland mentioned, that includes a prohibition of stimulated activities being, fluids being discharged to pits directly, and there have been enforcement actions taken by the regional board for those that they have discovered. A work plan was developed and put forward by the regional board to look at all the pits in the Central Valley. To date, all known ponds have been inspected. Information orders have been issued to the operators requiring information about the discharge to those pits. Just for your information, that inspection led to discovering that there were approximately 540 pits that had waste discharge requirements, so they were under regulation by the regional board for that discharge to them, and that those regulations require some monitoring and that the pits don't impact the beneficial use. What they found is that many of those were outdated. They were many, many years old, and they needed updating, and they have been in the process of updating those. There were 324, some active, some inactive, that were not permitted, and those were issued cleanup and abatement orders to cease and desist discharge and get either permits for them or to cease. And to provide information about the groundwater quality and association. In addition, the regional board just on July 30th issued a cease and desist order for a group of ponds associated with the valley waste. These require them to do an analysis, to look at a work plan to remediate the pollution, and puts them on a time frame for 2018 to either meet all the requirements or cease discharge. And then finally, it was asked that I comment on the issue of phasing out pits and disposal activities. We are totally in support of the idea that that fracking flowback water from well stimulation shouldn't be disposed of in unlined pits. It's unclear at this point if it's the right idea to completely phase out produced water. It clearly needs to meet the beneficial uses and have monitoring and treatment if it's appropriate. But this is a source of potentially a source of water in a state where water is very important, and injecting all of that back into deep well injection takes it out of the cycle and doesn't make it available for beneficial use. So we think that looking at monitoring and treatment where it's appropriate, so that these pits, or what I would call groundwater recharge basins for produced water, have meet all the requirements and are safe for use, is the direction that seems, to us to make the most sense. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.